Well, welcome to the Books and Music Review. We're going to bring you into the studio in a couple of minutes. Right now, we have Jihad reviewing a book called Answering Jihad, A Better Way Forward. Here you go. It's up to you.
Thank you for that introduction. So, today we'll be analyzing a book by the late Christian apologist Nabeel Qureshi. And as was said, it's entitled Answering Jihad, A Better Way Forward. This is the third of three books written by Nabeel Qureshi during his lifetime. The other two were his memoir, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, which was a New York Times bestseller and continues to have extensive influence on the apologetics world and on Christians and questioning Muslims throughout the world, even to this day. The other is an apologetics book, No God But One, which is a critical analysis of Islam and Christianity and a comparison between the two, testing the truth claims of each religion and their sacred texts. And I've reviewed the previous two books on this show. So today I'll be looking at Answering Jihad, which is a much shorter, approximately 150 page long book, not counting the appendices, which include some of the hadith, some of the Islamic hadith that are analyzed in this book. And this book was written primarily in response to the San Bernardino attacks. Now, for those of you who don't remember, this was a massacre that took place approximately 4 years ago, wherein two Muslim social workers went to their workplace and massacred mentally challenged and mentally ill people and their caretakers and assorted other people who were in the vicinity. And it was a very newsworthy event because it was yet another instance of quote-unquote radicalized Muslims or jihadists engaging in terror on U.S. soil. So it was a domestic terror attack carried out by two Muslims, similar to what happened during the Fort Hood shooting, where Army psychologist Nabeel Malik Hassan killed 13 soldiers at the Fort Hood Army base, and the Pulse nightclub shooting, and a series of other jihadist attacks that have been chronicled and debated. And Answering Jihad is Nabeel Qureshi's response to this, not only this attack, but similar attacks, and trying to grapple with the challenges presented by a large minority, the Islamic community in the U.S., between 2 and 3% of the population, which has seen a burgeoning jihadist element within that community. For example, in Minneapolis, there have been dozens of recruits for ISIS in Syria and al-Shabaab in Somalia, and people have been brought back to the United States to face prosecutions, and multiple terror cells that have emerged within Minneapolis, and terror attacks, such as an attack at a Minnesotan university by a Somali man whose family was brought here as refugees, just like the current congresswoman from Minneapolis, Ilhan Omar, whose family was brought here from Kenya and resettled in Minnesota. So this book is a response to this increasing conflict we have between American and Western norms and values and an Islamic worldview that seeks to impose a completely different set of values upon American society. And it's interesting that Nabeel was the one to address this because he had a unique perspective as someone who came from a very marginalized Islamic sect, the Ahmadiyya, and someone who was an American whose family was very patriotic. In fact, he was, during his early childhood, he was stationed, his father was stationed overseas in Scotland, and his father was a career Navy seaman. And he also had other relatives who served in the U.S. Armed Forces, but at the same time, his family was also had a lot of Islamic missionaries, people who would spread the Ahmadi message and actually go out into other parts of the world, Africa, Europe, spreading the message of Ahmed, who was a prophetic figure who is denounced by most Orthodox Muslims, but revered within this community. And he came from a very conservative Muslim background. So his mother, for example, engaged in purdah, which is an Indian Pakistani practice within Islam, where the woman is completely removed from society. So she doesn't associate with any males who are not directly related to her. So he came at this from a very interesting perspective, which is one of a very patriotic family, but also one that was very deeply conservative and very deeply Islamic. And this book is his way of trying to address this issue and to see how Islam can be reconciled with American values and whether there's a better way to tackle the jihadist threat and the threat of quote-unquote radical Islam. So the book itself consists of a series of questions, 18 questions. The first one, the very basic question, what is Islam? Addressed to people who might be very confused. And he tries to distinguish between Muslims as individuals and the Islamic religion. And a recurring theme throughout this book is trying to dispel the notion that criticizing Islam is an attack on individual Muslims, much less some sort of coded racial or ethnic attack on the Muslims who immigrate to the U.S., primarily from countries like Pakistan or India or the Middle East or North Africa, who are not white. So a lot of apologists for Islam and leftists, progressives, try to imply that attacking the underlying roots of Islam and attacking the philosophy of Islam is an attack on non-white immigrants. And Nabeel tries to dispel this myth in this first chapter and throughout the book. And the second chapter is a related question: is Islam a religion of peace? And he tries to rebut the notion that's been perpetuated that Islam is a religion of peace by analyzing the etymology of the word itself, which is derived from salama or aslama, surrender, which is derived from salama, to make oneself safe. And the idea is you made yourself safe by surrendering or submitting to Islam. So it doesn't necessarily mean peace, even though in a sense, the root is derived from a related noun, it's not the same thing. The actual word itself translates to surrender, and it's used within the context of the creation of Islam, which was Muhammad forcing or enjoining people he conquered to surrender to Islam, to either submit through yielding and taxation or face the consequences, which was usually annihilation and expulsion, which is what he did with the Khuraza and Nadir Jewish tribes and other Arabian tribes who refused to submit to Islam. And he explains how this idea of Islam being a religion of peace was a very newfound notion, a Sufi notion that was introduced only less than 150 years ago. And it's been adopted by apologists for Islam and groups like CARE and their progressive allies in order to stifle criticism, legitimate critiques of Islam and the outgrowths of Islam in the form of jihad. So it continues with question 3, which is, what is jihad? And again, here he deconstructs the argument that there are different notions of jihad and concedes that there is, and he cites the source here, al-Bahaki al-Zud al-Kabir, where Muhammad, after he's asked about jihad, he says, what is the greater jihad? And his response is, for the servant of God to fight his passions. And they're using this tradition in order to justify the argument that the greater jihad is non-violent, whereas that's not what jihad was understood to mean within the Quran. And in the next chapter, he expands upon this topic. The question is jihad in the Quran in the life of Muhammad? And he describes how jihad, how the Quran is replete with references to jihad. So Surah 9, which is the most important surah on this topic, embeds the Islamic philosophy when it comes to jihad, which is to basically wage war against people who do not submit to Muhammad as an apostle of Islam, of Allah rather, who do not submit to him. And Surah 9, which is entitled The Disavowal, is chronologically the last surah. And in Islam, there's something known as the theory of abrogation, wherein one surah will abrogate a previous surah. So if there's a surah that commends peaceful relations that Muhammad may have, that that you can trace back to a period, the Meccan period, say, if that surah is abrogated by something like Surah 9, then Surah 9 is what takes precedence. So waging war against non-Muslims is something that would take precedence. The disavowal was literally the last and the final surah which speaks to this topic. Therefore, it's the one relied upon by Muslims. And this is something that's reflected in reality, where you see the first 200 years of Islamic history is replete with massacres, from the conquest of Egypt and North Africa to the Holocaust that was undertaken when Arab armies invaded Hindustan, what's now Pakistan and India, the Indian subcontinent, and razed numerous places of worship and murdered scores of people, all in actions that were justified by the Quran. So in this chapter, he does a good job of analyzing what jihad really is when understood in context, not simply a soundbite where an Islamic apologist or someone who wants to defend Islam tries to portray jihad as a benign inward struggle that Muslims have, which they must conquer inner demons. So he does a great job of analyzing this and using specific examples. For example, the Chronicles of John, Bishop of Niku, reveals what happened during the Muslim conquest of northern Egypt in 640 A.D. So this was after Muhammad's death. Amar and the Muslim army made their entry into Nakias Niku and took possession. Finding no soldiers, they proceeded to put to the sword all whom they found in the streets and in the churches, men, women, and infants. They showed mercy to none. Let us now cease, for it is impossible to recount the iniquities perpetrated by the Muslims after their capture of the island of Nakias. This is how, and this is Nabeel speaking now, this is how history recounts one of Muhammad's companions enacting jihad. Even though the record contains the slaughter of non-combatants, it appears to be more consistent with a plain reading of Surah 9 than do views of peaceful or defensive jihad. And this is something that's backed up, he goes on to explain, in the Hadith. And if you read the Hadith, they are used to give context and flesh out the Quran, which otherwise would be a very incomprehensible book. And so the Hadith, these actually do make for more interesting reading, but they're also revelatory in the sense of giving you an idea of how Muhammad's principles were used, and very often they were used to attack and mercilessly slaughter anyone who opposed Islam. And Nabeel analyzes this in a very straightforward, non-tendentious way, and explains why jihad is not simply a peaceful inner struggle. And he goes on to explain in question 5, what is Sharia, the application of Surah 9, and how it's used in the codices and the everyday law, Sharia of Muslim nations, which are based on the actions, i.e. Sunnah, and the Hadith, i.e. sayings, using the consensus of Islamic scholars, which is known as ijma, and their reasoning, which is qiyas. These are the 4 steps that a Muslim jurist must use. And again, this is very useful for understanding what Islam is in practice, and dispelling a lot of the myths that surround Islam, particularly in Western nations where people haven't been exposed to these teachings. And in question 6, he answers, was Islam spread by the sword? And of course, the answer to that is obviously yes. Here he says, Muhammad said, I have been ordered to fight against the people until they testify that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah. Only then will they save their lives and property from us. And the golden age of Islam, which is extolled, began with a series of offensive battles and wars of conquest. And if you look throughout Islamic history, it's littered with the bodies of people who refuse to accept Islam. And there are hardly any there are hardly any instances of the peaceful application of Islam. People like to point to, Islamic apologists love to point to Indonesia or the Maldives, but these are 2 very isolated examples out of hundreds of places and regions in the world where Islam was spread by the sword. And question 7 deals with radical Islam, and particularly the idea of takfir and takfiris, who are people who, these are Muslims who have subjected themselves to brutal violence because they have not adhered to Islam properly. And this is something you see within jihadist circles all the time, calling someone a takfir or a hypocrite. And for the people who say ISIS does not represent Islam, despite the fact that it literally means the Islamic State, they have to deal with this idea that takfir was something endorsed by Muhammad himself. And in the Quran, he categorically attacks hypocrites. And these are people who would be considered Muslims, but who did not obey Muhammad, or who, after following Muhammad for a period, broke off. So the idea that what ISIS is doing, or what Al-Qaeda is doing, in the form of attacking takfiris and bombing mosques, that this is somehow divorced or can be detached from the roots of Islam, is simply not borne out by history or reality. And in question 8, he addresses the idea that Islam needs a reformation, and points out that the jihadists actually are the reformers, people like Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the people who started the Muslim Brotherhood, like Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb. They actually are in the place of Martin Luther or John Calvin, because these people were trying to get Christianity back to its roots after centuries of man-made teachings and doctrine that were superimposed over Scripture. And this is what jihadists are doing. This is what Osama bin Laden and his mentors were trying to do. The people who assassinated Anwar Sadat, they were trying to get Islam back to its roots in the Quran, in the Hadith, and overthrow centuries of man-made edicts and regulations that were superimposed over the core structure of Islam. And then the next question addresses Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Boko Haram specific groups. And question 10, who are the true Muslims, violent or peaceful Muslims? And this is an interesting question because it comes to the conclusion that you can't really say whether violent or peaceful Muslims are the true Muslims. Islam is such a broad spectrum. And the idea of takfiri, of ostracizing Muslims, which is popular among more liberal Muslims, and they target groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and those groups target liberal Muslims themselves. And neither one is correct, in the sense that you can't really say who are the true Muslims. Even Nabeel himself was attacked by Islamic apologists and dawah teams who despised him sharing the gospel with Muslims because he belonged to a sect that was heterodox. But the reality is that the Ahmadis were Muslims, in the sense that they recited the Shahada, they did the 5 pillars, they believed in the 6 articles of faith, and the only difference between Ahmadis and Orthodox Muslims was that they believed Ahmad was a prophet, which Orthodox Muslims reject. And they say that these can't be real Muslims because you would say that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. That means there are no prophets. But even Orthodox Muslims believe there will be another prophet after Muhammad. They believe Jesus, whom they consider Jesus, Isa, will come back at the end times and murder Jews and Christians for not following Muhammad. So they believe in a prophet after Muhammad, just like the Ahmadis. It's simply a difference over eschatology, similar to the difference between people who believe in Christians who believe in a pre-trib rapture and those who believe in a post-tribulation rapture. They're simply interpreting certain events and certain people differently. That doesn't mean they reject core doctrine. So the question 11, why are Muslims being radicalized, is a very fascinating question because he gets to the heart of this, which is the internet and the explosion of information because of cyberspace. The fact that Muslims can now actually analyze the hadith and the tafsir and the Quran, and they can look up Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and Sunan Abu Dawud in their own languages and read them, is accelerating this radicalization in several directions. It's accelerating the number of Muslims leaving Islam, and there are more apostates, even if many of them are not public with their apostasy because of threats to their lives. There are more apostates than ever before in history, but there are also more jihadists than there are in history because they can access these texts in their own language and read them for themselves, just like after the Reformation, ordinary people could read the Bible in the vernacular. The difference in this case is that they're using that information in order to wage jihad, one group, and the other group is becoming apostates. And Nabeel explains how there are only three paths, and these were the paths he was looking at before he eventually was led to Christ. The path of radicalization, saying to yourself, you have to accept that Muhammad was a brutal warlord and he did do these awful things, but they're defensible from an Islamic standpoint. Therefore, I'm going to follow in his footsteps and become a jihadist. You can either follow that path. You can follow the path of apathy, just ignore all of this information that's at your fingertips and kind of muddle along as a nominal Muslim, or you can become an apostate like Nabeel did before he accepted Christ as his Lord. So this is a very edifying chapter. And there are many other chapters, but I'll just focus on this one, which is Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? And I'll wrap up the show with this. And the answer, of course, is no. And again, the idea of them worshiping the same God, he focuses on the Wheaton controversy, where a professor was forced to step down after claiming that Muslims and Christians are essentially worship the same God. And he explains how this can't be, because the gospel flatly contradicts the Quran, which denies the Trinity and denies the deity of Jesus Christ. And the gospel, both the synoptic gospels and the Gospel of John, contrary to Muslim claims, reaffirm and extol the divinity of Christ. And even if you're skeptical of those, 1 Corinthians 15 repeatedly goes down a very clear delineation by Paul of how Christ was crucified, died, and resurrected, and appeared to the apostles, to hundreds of others, and then finally to Paul as one born out of time. And 1 Corinthians, this part of 1 Corinthians is essentially relying on credo statements that existed within a few years after Christ was crucified. So even if you want to scoff at the Gospels, you can't deny that that this part of the New Testament was taken from the earliest church, the earliest people in the church who knew and saw and spoke with Christ himself. And Muslims deny this flatly. So the idea that you can reconcile the idea of a Muslim God, Allah, which is simply one God taken from a pantheon of pagan gods and extolled as monotheism when it's really monolatry, if that. The idea that you can compare that to Jesus Christ and the Trinity, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, is simply absurd. And I would recommend that everyone get a copy of this book if they have the opportunity, Answering Jihad, A Better Way Forward by Nabeel Qureshi, and his other books if they have the chance, Seeking Allah, Finding God, Finding Jesus in particular. It's a beautiful memoir, and Nabeel had an enormous influence on the world and continues to this day. Thank you for watching.